Hello. Today we're going to take a look at some strategies for supporting LGBTQIA plus youth, dealing with questions that youth might have, how we can create a supportive environment for those youth as well. So, who are these strategies mostly geared toward? Anyone who works with youth essentially should be able to benefit from taking some of these tools and these strategies and applying them into whatever kind of work they're doing. So teachers, outside educators, maybe coming in as a guest speaker from an outside agency, will be faced with questions from youth. Counselors, social workers, caseworkers, healthcare providers, all of us who deal with youth on some level in whatever field we're in can hopefully take some of these strategies and these tools and bring them with us into our practice and our service. Why are youth questions important, and why is how we deal with them important? So, the first reason that youth questions are important is that they provide an opportunity for us to reinforce education. So, it allows us to reintroduce a point or a topic that came up before that was particularly important. It allows us to revisit things that we didn't maybe spend enough time on in the first place. It also helps us to learn what these youth want to know and what they feel is important. So maybe we've been spending time on a point or a topic that we, as an educator, as an adult, feel is important, but that's not necessarily as important to those youth. And maybe what they want to know isn't something we had thought about in the first place. So it can help us to inform our practice that way. Additionally, asking questions can make us vulnerable. And this applies especially for youth, and especially when we talk about things like gender, identity, sexual health, sexuality, topics like that, which can be awkward for youth to discuss in the first place. And then when we add to that asking a question, maybe in front of a group of their peers in a classroom, that can add an extra layer of vulnerability. And so the way we deal with those questions can help to mitigate some of that maybe feeling of anxiety that a student might have in asking a question if we know how to address it and to deal with it in a way that isn't going to make that student feel vulnerable. Our first step to addressing some of those anxieties and those vulnerabilities is creating an educational environment that's inclusive. And there are a few different ways we can go about that. The first one, right off the bat, we want to set up community agreements or ground rules or house rules, whatever you want to call them. And this is something that most of us are probably pretty familiar with, right? We raise our hands when we have something to say or ask a question. That's a ground rule, right? That's a community agreement. And there are a lot of different community agreements that we can bring to the table. So making sure that everyone is being respected and that they know that there is a process maybe to go through if they feel like the conversation isn't being respectful. There are tools that we can put in place to help mitigate maybe that sense of anxiety that someone might experience. Language use is also really important for creating that environment. So, a couple of just general tools that I use and a lot of our education colleagues use, we try to use terms like folks instead of guys. Some people view guys as a gender neutral term, but not everyone does. And when we're speaking to mixed groups, we don't necessarily know how everyone feels about the neutrality of that term, so we use folks as a replacement. Another tool that can be useful in the right circumstance is using anatomy focused language when we refer to people. So we might say people with a uterus instead of women, because as we know, not everyone who has a uterus identifies as a woman, and inversely, not everyone who identifies as a woman is a person who has a uterus. So if we're talking about biological processes or puberty or development or something like that, that can be a time when we use that anatomy focused language because it takes the gender, it takes the person out of what we're talking about. So we're not putting people into boxes or into baskets where they don't feel like they fit, but we're assuming that they do, maybe just based on how they appear to us on the other side of that classroom. Pronoun use can be another community agreement or ground rule. So making sure that if folks are comfortable sharing the pronouns that they use, that everybody's respecting those pronouns and using the pronouns that people use for themselves. That doesn't necessarily have to be a 100% hard and fast rule. So the way I go about that is that if folks want to share their pronouns, they're more than welcome to, but no one has to share those pronouns if they don't feel comfortable with that. Because some people maybe in certain environments are comfortable sharing their pronouns, maybe at home or with a group of friends, but maybe in a larger classroom or a room full of people they don't know, they might not be comfortable making that disclosure. So I tend to leave that up to individuals to decide for themselves. What sorts of questions do youth ask? And basically, there's 5 categories, but there tends to be a lot of overlap. So oftentimes, one example of a question can be thought of in 2 or 3 different ways. The simplest form is an information or a clarification question. So this is, I didn't understand XYZ. Can you re-explain this point you made? Something like that. Usually something factual. There are shock or attention-seeking questions. Those can be topic dependent. So as someone who educates on reproductive health, those are questions that we tend to experience, but you might not, depending on what sort of education that you're providing. The 3 that we're really going to focus on are permission-seeking questions, am I normal questions, and values-based questions. And these 3 are a little bit trickier to deal with, and they all are dealt with in similar ways. Some require a little bit of extra preparation if possible. So those are the 3 sorts that we're going to dive into and take a little bit closer look at. So how do we deal with these types of questions? In general, again, they're all pretty similar strategies. When we deal with permission-seeking questions, one thing we want to keep in mind is that there's often a question behind the question. And usually that question behind the question is, I'm doing or thinking about engaging in the behavior that I'm asking about. But I'm asking a question to hide the fact that maybe I'm engaging in that behavior, right? It's the old I'm asking for a friend situation. And so we want to keep that in mind. That's not always the case, but oftentimes there is that question behind the question. So we want to keep that in mind. We want to reinforce safety and consent. That's paramount when we talk about permission seeking questions. Again, particularly with things like sexuality and sexual behavior. And we also want to acknowledge any rules and laws that might be present. So oftentimes permission seeking questions will be about particular sexual behaviors, and they might be coming from folks who are under the age of consent. So it's not necessarily our job to tell folks what they can and can't do or should and shouldn't be doing, but we do want to remind them that these laws are in place. These are the rules for whatever situation we're in, while still acknowledging that it's a personal choice and a personal behavior. Another tip that can be useful is to replace the word you with the word someone, particularly in group settings. So oftentimes the question will be phrased with a you in it, but I find that responding with the word you can feel like it's singling out the person who asked, even if it's a rhetorical you. So I find that using the word someone kind of removes that asker from the equation. And now we're not talking about a specific person. We're talking about this hypothetical someone. And they could be anybody, rather than kind of all eyes turn to that person who asked the particular question. Am I normal questions? Again, we can deal with in a similar way. Again, there's often a question behind that question. Usually, is it normal to blank can mean I'm experiencing blank and I'm concerned about it. So we do want to keep that in mind again. Another language trick here, I like to replace the word normal with typical or common, because if something isn't normal, then we see it as abnormal. And abnormal has some connotations that maybe we don't want to attach to a behavior or to an experience. So words like typical or common tend to remove some of that. We also want to acknowledge the range of behavior or experience and not just the extremes. So a trick we can use for this is an acronym called SOY, which stands for Some Others You. So that's a really good way to make sure we acknowledge the entire spectrum of experience and not just the two extremes at the end. And we'll get into some more specific examples of how we can use SOY to illustrate that whole spectrum of experience. And then the third type are values-based questions, and these can be particularly tricky depending on what sort of environment we're working in, um, maybe geographically where we are. Cultures vary from place to place, and so the cultural context of where we're discussing values can be different as well. The acronym we can use to deal with values-based questions is ANSWER. So we want to affirm the asker. We want to note that the question's values-based. We want to state any relevant facts or information, because even though it's a values-based question, there are often relevant factual pieces of information that we can kind of lean on. We want to ask, what's the range of values? And again, not just the extremes. So we'll use SOY again there. We want to encourage conversation with a trusted adult, and we want to remain available. And that can go especially if we are someone who is continually working with that youth. So maybe we're their regular classroom teacher or their regular healthcare provider. We want to make sure that we're available if maybe they don't have that trusted adult, or maybe we are that trusted adult. We want to make sure those lines of communication can stay open. In part 2, we're going to take a look at some examples of how we can apply those frameworks, things like SOY, things like ANSWER, to actual questions that youth have brought to the table.